All right, so today we're going to try to tackle something pretty big, I guess you could say,
Mm.
progress.
Mm.
It's a word that gets used pretty often. You know, we talk about societal progress and technological progress all the time.
Right.
But if we want to really get philosophical about it, like, what are we actually talking about?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it?
And I mean, looking back, I guess, at history, can we even really say that we've made progress, with everything that's happened?
Yeah, well, I mean, the idea that humanity is on some kind of upward trajectory towards a better future
Right.
that really took root during the Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries.
Okay.
And it offered this really powerful narrative. It wasn't just a random series of events,
Right.
but something with a direction, maybe even a purpose leading towards greater freedom and flourishing.
Okay, so there was a direction they were thinking about, but our sources point to two main ways they thought about that direction. Like one where it was almost like a given that we'd progress, and another where it was more like we could progress, but it wasn't a sure thing.
Exactly. So on the one hand, you have these teleological accounts of progress, and these are basically saying that history has an endpoint.
Okay.
It's all leading somewhere specific, like to a state of perfect freedom or something like that. And progress is kind of like this inevitable unfolding towards that endpoint.
Okay, I see. So it's like saying there's a script and we're all just following it.
Yeah, something like that.
And what about the other view, the one that wasn't so sure about things?
Right. So those are the non-teleological accounts, and they see progress as emerging from a bunch of different factors.
Hmm.
Things like human nature, our ability to reason, and the institutions we build.
Okay, so more about how we interact with the world and each other.
Exactly. Progress in this view isn't guaranteed, but it's definitely possible if the conditions are right.
Okay, so I guess if we were explaining this to like another philosopher, someone who's into metaphysics,
Yep.
the teleological view is like saying history has this telos, a predetermined goal, and non-teleological is more about cause and effect leading to something that we just happen to call progress.
Exactly. So the teleological view, it's all about this ultimate purpose.
Yeah.
Like there's some kind of force driving history towards a predetermined outcome.
Right.
And the non-teleological view, it's more grounded.
Mm-hmm.
It's looking at the specifics of what humans do, how they interact with each other and with their environment.
So like on the teleological side, we have Hegel, right? He's all about this grand narrative of history unfolding.
Yeah, Hegel's the poster child for teleological progress. You could say he believed in this thing called the Geist, it's like this world spirit or something.
Okay.
And he thought it was driving history towards this ultimate realization of freedom.
Wow. So like everything that happens, even the bad stuff, is part of this grand plan?
Yeah, that was his view. And it's obviously a bit controversial,
Yeah.
saying that things like war and suffering are just necessary steps towards freedom.
Right. That doesn't sit well with a lot of people.
No, it doesn't.
And I mean, Hegel was also pretty specific about how he saw this freedom unfolding, right? Like he thought it culminated in a certain type of state.
Yeah, he really thought the Prussian state was the peak of historical development. The embodiment of this Geist.
Which I guess is pretty Eurocentric.
Definitely. And not many people buy into that specific interpretation anymore.
Makes sense. And on the other side, you have Marx, who's also influenced by Hegel, but he was looking at things a bit differently.
Right. Marx kept the whole dialectical thing going, but he grounded it in what he called historical materialism.
Okay, so instead of a world spirit, it's about material conditions.
Exactly.
Oh.
He thought that the way we produce and distribute things, the material stuff, that's the real driving force of history.
So he wasn't denying that there was like a direction to history. He just thought it was rooted in something more tangible.
Yeah, he thought that the economic system shapes everything, from our social relationships to our ideas.
Mm.
And he saw history as this process of different economic systems clashing and evolving until you eventually get to communism, which he saw as the final stage.
Okay, so even though Hegel and Marx had different ideas about what was driving history, they both believed it was going somewhere.
Yeah, they were both teleological thinkers.
Yeah.
They thought history had an endpoint.
So what were the key things they agreed on?
Well, first of all, they thought that progress was predetermined. It was going to happen no matter what.
Okay.
And second, they thought it applied to all of humanity.
Right.
It wasn't just one specific culture or group that was progressing.
Right.
And third, they thought it followed a linear path, always moving upwards towards this final state.
Okay, I get it. So that's the kind of classic Enlightenment view progress as this unstoppable force moving everyone towards a better future.
Yeah, that's one way to see it.
But then you have someone like Kant, who was also an Enlightenment thinker, but he didn't seem to buy into that whole inevitability thing.
Yeah. Kant is an interesting case. He definitely had some things to say about progress, but it wasn't always clear-cut.
Right. Like our sources mentioned that there's actually some debate about whether he was even fully on board with the whole progress idea.
Yeah, so in some of his writings, he talks about nature having a plan, to bring about a perfect society.
Okay.
And that sounds kind of teleological, right?
Yeah, like he's saying there's a predetermined outcome.
Exactly. But most scholars these days, they think we should interpret that stuff differently.
Okay, how so?
Well, they say it's more like a heuristic assumption.
A heuristic assumption.
Yeah, like a rule of thumb that helps us act in a certain way.
Okay.
So instead of saying that progress is actually guaranteed by nature, it's more like we should act as if it is.
Oh, I see. So it's more about keeping hope alive and motivating us to work towards a better future.
Exactly. It's about giving us a reason to strive for something, even if we can't be sure it'll actually happen.
Okay, that makes sense. And so for Kant, progress is more about what humans do rather than some external force.
Exactly. He was really interested in how human nature shapes our ability to progress.
Okay, so what did he see as the key ingredients, I guess, for making progress happen?
Well, he focused on two main things, our capacity for reason and what he called unsocial sociability.
Unsocial sociability. That's a mouthful.
Yeah, it basically means that we're drawn to living in groups, but we also have this tendency to be selfish and competitive.
Okay, so like we want to be social, but we also kind of suck at it.
Yeah, kind of. And Kant thought that this tension, between our social and selfish impulses, that's actually what drives us to develop reason.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's like by bumping heads with each other, we learn to think more rationally and figure out ways to live together peacefully.
Exactly.
Okay. And this is where institutions come in, right? Like Kant thought they played a big role in making progress happen.
Definitely, he believed that we need the right kind of social and political structures to channel that unsocial sociability in a positive direction.
So like setting up rules and systems that encourage cooperation and discourage conflict?
Yeah. And he was a big fan of republics,
Mm-hmm.
where people have a say in how they're governed.
Okay.
He thought that was the best way to promote freedom and rationality.
But he didn't think institutions were like a magic bullet, right?
No, he knew that even with the best institutions, progress isn't guaranteed. It still depends on people making good choices.
Right. So even though Kant was an Enlightenment thinker, his view of progress was a lot more cautious than some of his contemporaries.
Definitely, he saw it as something we need to constantly work towards, not something that's just going to happen on its own.
Okay, that's super helpful. And it kind of sets us up to talk about more contemporary views on progress.
Yeah, because the 20th century definitely threw a wrench in the whole Enlightenment optimism thing.
Right. I mean, 2 world wars and all the other terrible things that happened. It's hard to talk about inevitable progress after that.
Yeah, it really forced people to reevaluate what progress even means and whether it's even possible.
So what are some of the key ways that contemporary philosophers are thinking about progress differently?
Well, I think one big change is that we're much more aware of how complex it is. Progress in one area can sometimes lead to problems in another area.
Right. It's not this simple upward trajectory anymore.
Exactly. And we're also more sensitive to the fact that different cultures might have different ideas about what progress looks like.
Okay, so it's not this one-size-fits-all concept.
Nope. And there's also a lot more emphasis on the potential for things to go wrong.
Yeah.
We're not as naive about the risks involved in trying to change things.
And a lot of these newer perspectives are drawing on insights from evolutionary science, right?
Yeah, that's a huge development. I mean, evolutionary theory has really changed how we understand ourselves and our place in the world.
Okay, so how does that apply to the idea of progress?
Well, it helps us see that a lot of our behaviors and institutions, they're not just arbitrary. They've been shaped by natural selection over millions of years.
Okay, so like things like cooperation and altruism, they're not just nice ideas. They actually helped our ancestors survive and reproduce.
Exactly. And even things like morality and a sense of fairness can be understood as adaptations that helped us solve the challenges of group living.
Oh, that's fascinating. So it's like progress from an evolutionary perspective is all about becoming more adapted to our environment, both the natural environment and our social environment.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay, so different thinkers within this evolutionary framework, they're focusing on slightly different aspects, right?
Yeah. For example, Philip Kitcher, he talks about how our ancestors faced these altruism failures.
Altruism failures.
Yeah, situations where people didn't cooperate enough and it led to bad outcomes.
Okay.
And he thinks that our ability to understand and follow rules, what he calls our capacity for normative guidance,
Right.
that evolved to help us overcome those failures and cooperate better.
Oh, I see. So like rules and norms, they're not just arbitrary. They actually serve a purpose. They help us function as a society.
Yeah, and progress from this perspective is about refining those rules,
Yeah.
making them more effective at solving the problems we face as a group.
Okay. And others are taking a more general approach, right? Like just looking at how social and technological innovations have made life better overall.
Exactly like Hayek, for example. He had this really broad view of progress. He basically said that any innovation that helps us achieve our goals more efficiently, that's progress.
Okay. So a pretty practical definition.
Yeah, he wasn't really interested in grand narratives or moral ideals.
Yeah.
He just focused on what works.
I see. So this evolutionary perspective, it's a lot less about some predetermined endpoint and more about adapting and solving problems as they come up.
Exactly. It's a much more dynamic view.
Okay, and it sounds like it also leaves room for setbacks. Things don't always have to get better.
Right, progress isn't this straight line upwards. It can be messy and unpredictable.
Okay, I get it, but then there's the whole question of morality, right?
Yes, morality.
Because some philosophers, they're not satisfied with just explaining morality as a product of evolution.
Right, they think there's something more to it, like some objective moral truths that exist independently of us.
Okay, and they would say that moral progress is about discovering those truths, not just developing better adaptations.
Exactly.
So how do these moral realists explain how we actually figure out these moral truths?
Well, Peter Singer, for example, he's a utilitarian, and he thinks that we can access moral truths through reason.
Oh.
So by using reason, we can kind of transcend our own biases and see things from an impartial point of view.
Right. So it's about trying to overcome our own self-interest and see what's best for everyone.
Yeah. And he thinks that a lot of moral progress happens when we become more aware of the suffering of others and we start to care about their well-being as much as our own.
Okay. And what about other moral realists like Nagel? What's his take on this?
Well, Nagel, he's a bit more nuanced.
Yeah.
He agrees that there are objective moral truths, but he thinks they're not always easy to grasp.
Okay.
So he distinguishes between discovering those truths and developing moral norms.
Oh, I see. So discovering a moral truth is like realizing that something is inherently wrong, like slavery, for example. But developing a moral norm is more about figuring out how to actually live according to that truth.
Yeah, so like developing norms around freedom of speech or equality.
Right. So it's like taking those abstract moral truths and figuring out how to apply them in the real world.
Exactly.
Okay, that's helpful. And it brings us back to the question of how we actually measure progress if there are all these different values and frameworks floating around.
Right. That's the million-dollar question. How do we know if we're actually getting better?
Yeah, because what looks like progress to one person might look like a step backwards to someone else.
Exactly. And the Enlightenment idea that freedom is the ultimate goal, well, that's been challenged a lot in recent decades.
Right, because focusing on just one value can lead to blind spots.
Definitely.
So what are some of the ways that philosophers are trying to grapple with this problem?
Well, some, like Jameson, they suggest starting with really clear-cut cases of progress.
Okay, like what?
Things like the abolition of slavery or the reduction of violence.
Okay, so things that most people would agree are good.
Yeah, but even that approach has its problems. Whose perspective are we using to decide what counts as progress?
Right. It could be biased.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then you have the pragmatists like Kitcher and Anderson. They're all about problem solving.
Okay.
So they say progress is about identifying and addressing these problematic situations.
Like injustice or inequality?
Exactly.
Okay.
And they emphasize the importance of dialogue, bringing people together to figure out solutions.
Okay, so progress is more about a process than a specific outcome.
Yeah, and then you have the moral realists like Sauer and Humer.
Right.
They say that even though there are lots of different values out there, we can still see some general trends.
Like what?
Well, they point to things like the growing recognition of moral equality and human dignity.
Okay.
And they say that even though there are still disagreements about specific issues, those underlying values are becoming more widely accepted.
Okay, so they're seeing progress in the big picture, even if there are bumps along the way.
Yeah, that's their argument.
Okay, and we keep coming back to this issue of human nature. Like, are we fundamentally good or bad? Are we capable of making real progress?
Right, and that's a question that philosophers have been wrestling with for centuries.
And it seems like our view of human nature really shapes how we think about progress.
Definitely, like if you think humans are inherently selfish and short-sighted,
Yeah.
then you're probably not going to be too optimistic about our chances of creating a better world.
Right, but if you think we have the capacity for reason and compassion,
Yeah.
then you might be more hopeful.
So where do contemporary philosophers fall on this spectrum? Are they leaning more towards pessimism or optimism?
Well, there's a range of views, but one perspective that's been gaining some traction is what's called evo-conservatism.
Evo-conservatism. Okay, I haven't heard that one before.
It's basically the idea that our evolutionary history has shaped us in ways that make it really hard to achieve certain kinds of progress.
Okay, how so?
Well, they argue that because we evolved in small groups, for most of human history,
We are naturally inclined to favor our own group over outsiders.
like tribalism.
Exactly. And they think that this tribalism is deeply ingrained in us.
Okay.
So even if we want to create a more globalized world where everyone is treated equally,
Yeah.
they think our biology might just get in the way.
So that's pretty pessimistic.
Yeah, it is. But there are others who challenge this view. They say that we're more adaptable than the evo-conservatives give us credit for.
Okay, so like our tribal instincts aren't set in stone.
Right. They think that with the right kind of cultural and institutional changes, we can overcome those limitations.
Okay, so there's still some hope then.
Yeah, I think most philosophers would agree that we have at least some capacity to change our behavior and our values.
And reason plays a role in that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, reason is what allows us to reflect on our values and see if they're actually leading to good outcomes.
Right.
And it's also what allows us to imagine different ways of doing things and to come up with solutions to problems.
But there's also this whole debate about the role of emotions, right? Like, some people think emotions are more powerful than reason when it comes to driving change.
Yeah, that's a big debate in contemporary philosophy and psychology.
So what are the main arguments on each side?
Well, on the emotion side, you have people who point to all the research showing how emotions can influence our judgments and decisions, even when we think we're being rational.
Okay.
And they argue that a lot of social change is driven by emotional appeals, things like empathy, outrage, or a sense of injustice.
Right.
And then you have the rationalists who say that even though emotions are powerful, they can also be misleading.
Okay.
So they emphasize the importance of critical thinking and evidence-based reasoning.
Right. So it's not about denying the role of emotions. It's about making sure they're not leading us astray.
Exactly.
And how does all this connect to the idea of progress?
Well, it has implications for how we try to make the world a better place.
Okay.
Like if you think that emotions are the main driver of change,
Yeah.
then you might focus on strategies that appeal to people's hearts rather than their heads.
Okay. So like trying to evoke empathy or outrage.
Exactly. But if you think reason is more important,
Yeah.
then you might focus on things like education, public discourse, and trying to change people's minds through rational argument.
Right. So it's a question of which lever is more effective.
Yeah, and I think most philosophers would agree that it's probably a combination of both. We need to engage both our hearts and our minds if we want to make real progress.
Okay. That makes sense. And it seems like there's also a lot of focus these days on changing social norms.
Yeah, that's a big area of research and activism.
And how does that tie into the idea of progress?
Well, social norms are basically these unwritten rules that tell us how to behave in different situations.
Right.
And they can be really powerful. They can influence everything from our fashion choices to our political beliefs.
Okay, so if you want to change people's behavior, you have to change the norms that are driving that behavior.
Exactly. And there's been a lot of interesting work done on how to actually do that.
Like what?
Well, one approach is to try to make people aware of the norms that are operating in the background. The ones that they might not even be conscious of.
Okay.
And then you can start to challenge those norms by showing that they're not based on good reasons or that they're leading to harmful consequences.
Oh, I see. So it's like exposing the hidden rules of the game.
Exactly. And then once people start to question those rules,
Yeah.
it becomes easier to change them.
Okay, that's really interesting. And what about institutions? What role do they play in all of this?
Well, that's a big question, and there are a lot of different perspectives.
Okay.
But one common thread is the idea that institutions can either promote or hinder progress.
Right. So like if you have institutions that are corrupt or unjust.
Yeah, then it's going to be really hard to make progress, even if individuals are trying to do the right thing.
Okay. But on the other hand, if you have institutions that are fair and transparent.
Then it can make a huge difference.
So like a well-functioning democracy or a fair legal system.
Exactly. Those kinds of institutions can create the conditions for people to flourish and to work together towards common goals.
Okay. And some philosophers, they're even more radical. They think that real progress requires completely overhauling existing institutions.
Yeah, those are usually the folks coming from a Marxist perspective.
Right.
They see the state and the economic system as fundamentally rigged in favor of the powerful.
Okay.
So they think we need a revolution to create truly just and equitable institutions.
Wow. So they're not messing around.
Nope. They think incremental change isn't enough.
Yeah.
We need a complete transformation of society.
Okay. And then there are the social movements, right?
Yeah, social movements, they're playing a huge role in contemporary discussions about progress.
And how are they being seen?
Well, a lot of philosophers see them as a vital force for change.
Okay.
They turn out that social movements are often the ones who challenge unjust laws and norms
Right.
and who push for greater equality and justice.
Okay, so they're the ones who are actually making progress happen on the ground.
Yeah, that's the argument.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've gone from these grand narratives of history to these very specific discussions about how to change social norms and institutions.
Yeah, it's a pretty wild ride through the history of philosophy.
And it seems like the idea of progress itself has gone through a lot of changes.
Definitely, we've gone from this really optimistic view to a much more cautious and nuanced perspective.
Right.
And I think that's a good thing. We're more aware of the complexities and the potential pitfalls.
Yeah, and hopefully that means we'll be more thoughtful about how we try to make the world a better place.
Exactly.
So for you, the listener, I hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought.
Yeah, maybe it's even inspired you to think about your own role in making progress happen.
Right, like what are there specific changes you want to see in the world?
And how can you use your own talents and resources to make those changes a reality?
Okay, so those are some big questions to ponder. And if you want to explore these ideas further, our sources recommend checking out the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Yeah, it's a great resource for all things philosophical.
Okay, so thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the idea of progress.
It's been a pleasure.
And we'll see you next time.
See you later.
Bye!